There is a lot of anger in Australia over this week's visit by Prince Harry and Meghan. They are promoting their favorite causes and talking about life in California.
The plane touched down in Australia to global anticipation. Cameras ready, headlines waiting, a royal moment poised to unfold. But something was off. The cheers never rose, the energy never sparked, and the welcome felt restrained. Meghan and Harry stepped forward into a reception that looked royal, but didn't feel it. Behind polite smiles and measured gestures, an unspoken tension lingered in the air. Was this simply a quiet reception, or the first sign of something deeper unraveling? Because what happened next would turn that silence into something far more telling. What do you think really shifted in that moment, and what were people noticing that cameras couldn't fully capture? Drop your comment below and subscribe as we uncover the hidden truths behind the headlines. An arrival wrapped in silence. The moment their plane touched down in Australia, everything should have felt electric. This was, after all, the arrival of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, a couple whose presence had once drawn roaring crowds, flashing cameras, and an almost uncontrollable wave of excitement wherever they went. The stage was set. Media crews were already in position, lenses fixed, microphones ready, waiting to capture what was expected to be yet another defining royal moment. But something didn't quite connect. There was movement, yes. Cameras clicked, officials stood in place. Yet the atmosphere carried a strange stillness, as though the energy had been dialed down before the moment even began. The anticipation that usually builds into a crescendo simply didn't. Instead of cheers rising to greet them, there was a quiet murmur, subtle, restrained, almost cautious. It wasn't silence in the literal sense, but it felt close enough to raise questions. As the Duke and Duchess stepped forward, their arrival unfolded with a kind of careful precision. Their expressions remained composed, their gestures measured, every movement controlled. There were no spontaneous pauses to engage with the press, no extended moments to acknowledge the waiting crowd. It was swift, direct, almost unusually contained. For seasoned royal watchers, the difference was hard to ignore. Royal tours, especially in countries like Australia, have historically carried a certain rhythm, warmth from the public, visible enthusiasm, and a sense of shared excitement between the visitors and those welcoming them. That rhythm seemed disrupted here. The structure was still in place, the officials, the cameras, the protocol, but the emotional spark that typically brings such occasions to life felt noticeably absent. Even the press presence, though strong in number, appeared subdued in tone. Questions that might normally be called out were held back. Interactions that usually unfold naturally seemed shortened or skipped altogether. It created an unusual dynamic, a moment designed for visibility that somehow felt distant. And then came the exit. Instead of lingering, instead of allowing the moment to breathe, they moved on quickly. Their departure from the airport was efficient, almost understated, leaving behind an atmosphere that felt incomplete, as though something expected had simply not happened. The kind of arrival that should have marked the beginning of an energetic tour instead left behind a subtle sense of disconnect. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't openly negative, but it was different. And sometimes, it's not the loud moments that reveal the most, but the quiet ones that refuse to explain themselves. They didn't linger, didn't let the moment breathe, instead slipping away in silence that felt almost too controlled. Nothing went wrong, yet everything felt unfinished. So what really happened in those quiet seconds when expectation collapsed without warning? And why did that silence feel heavier than applause? Stay with us. Where the applause should have been, the quiet unease that followed their airport arrival did not fade as the day moved forward. Instead, it seemed to travel with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry as they made their way to their first official stop at Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne. On paper, the setting was ideal. A meaningful visit, a welcoming environment, and a gathered crowd ready to witness the beginning of what was expected to be a heartfelt and memorable tour. People were there. They had shown up, standing in place, watching closely, phones in hand, waiting for a moment that felt worthy of the occasion. Yet once again, something did not quite align. The energy that usually fills such spaces felt restrained, almost cautious, as though the crowd was unsure of how to respond. As the couple approached, greetings were exchanged, but they carried a softness that stood out. There were smiles, polite nods, and brief acknowledgments, but the warmth that often defines these interactions seemed muted. No waves of cheers broke through the air. No spontaneous excitement rippled across the crowd. Instead, there was a noticeable pause in the atmosphere, a kind of hesitation that lingered between each interaction. It was in these small moments that the difference became clearer. A greeting that might normally spark enthusiasm instead unfolded quietly. A gesture that could have drawn a reaction passed by with minimal response. Even the body language around them reflected a certain restraint. People watched, they observed, but they did not fully engage. It created a space where everything appeared correct on the surface, yet felt unusually distant beneath it. For those familiar with past royal visits, the contrast was difficult to overlook. Australia has long been known for its enthusiastic receptions, where crowds respond openly and moments feel shared between visitors and the public. That familiar rhythm, the natural exchange of energy, seemed disrupted here. The structure remained intact, but the connection felt weaker, less immediate. Inside the hospital, the tone remained consistent. Interactions were respectful and composed, yet they carried the same subtle lack of spark. Conversations appeared measured. Reactions remained gentle. It was not a rejection, but it was not the kind of warmth that usually defines such visits either. The cameras continued to capture every second, documenting what appeared to be a smooth and successful engagement. But beyond the images, there was an undercurrent that was harder to define. A sense that something was being held back, either by the crowd, the moment, or perhaps both. And as each interaction passed without that expected surge of emotion, the question grew harder to ignore. This was not just a quiet start, it was beginning to feel like a pattern. Everything looked flawless on camera, every moment neatly recorded as a successful royal engagement. But beneath the polished images, something unsettling lingered in the air. Was it the crowd holding back, the moment itself faltering, or something deeper unfolding quietly, as silence began shaping a pattern no one could ignore? Keep watching. When silence said more than words. By the time the visit inside Royal Children's Hospital Melbourne continued, the atmosphere had already settled into something that was becoming harder to overlook with each passing moment. What had initially appeared as a quiet and orderly reception was now revealing a more complex emotional texture. It was no longer just subdued in the way formal public events often are. Instead, it carried a sense of uncertainty that seemed to sit quietly in the background of every interaction. As Meghan Markle and Prince Harry moved deeper into the room, the nature of the engagement became increasingly restrained. Conversations that should have naturally expanded remained brief and contained. Greetings were exchanged, but they felt careful, almost as if every word had been measured before being spoken. The flow of interaction, which typically brings a sense of ease in such environments, appeared gently interrupted by an unspoken hesitation that no one directly acknowledged. Then came a moment that subtly shifted the tone even further. A greeting was offered, simple and expected in the context of the visit, yet the delivery of it carried an unusual softness. The words were spoken so quietly that they barely extended beyond the immediate space between the individuals involved. It was not dramatic, nor was it intentionally significant in its wording, but the tone itself changed how it landed. It felt closer to a whisper than a welcome, and that distinction lingered in the air longer than the words themselves. In that instant, the room seemed to collectively pause. There was no immediate reaction that typically follows such exchanges in public engagements of this nature. No spontaneous laughter, no visible wave of warmth, no shared moment of ease that helps dissolve formality. Instead, there was a noticeable pause, subtle enough to avoid attention on its own, but strong enough to be felt by those observing closely. Faces remained attentive, but the expressions carried restraint rather than release. Eyes followed the movement of the visit carefully, yet the usual emotional brightness that accompanies such moments appeared dimmed. Body language began to reflect this shift more clearly as time passed. Movements remained polite and respectful, as expected in a hospital setting with public figures present, but they lacked spontaneity. Smiles appeared briefly but often faded quickly. Gestures were returned appropriately, yet they did not extend into the kind of natural rhythm that builds connection in these environments. Even the overall sound of the room seemed to soften further, as though the earlier restraint had deepened into something more noticeable and sustained. It was in this subtle accumulation of detail that the silence began to take on weight. Silence in such moments is rarely empty. It often carries meaning that is not immediately spoken, revealing hesitation, uncertainty, or a distance that cannot easily be articulated. In this case, it did not present itself as discomfort in an obvious or disruptive way. Instead, it lingered quietly, forming a background presence that shaped how each interaction was perceived. For those paying close attention, a gradual realization began to form. This was no longer simply a composed and orderly visit moving through its expected stages. It had entered a space where the lack of reaction itself was becoming part of the story. Every subdued exchange, every careful response, and every restrained expression added to an impression that was growing stronger with each passing moment. And as the visit continued without the return of that familiar warmth or spontaneous energy, a quiet understanding began to settle in. This was not just a room filled with people observing a royal visit. It was a room caught in a moment where it was still trying to figure out how, or even whether, to respond at all. If the crowd was present, why did their energy feel absent? As though every reaction was delayed by hesitation no one could explain. And if this was meant to be a moment of celebration, what unseen shift turned applause into uncertainty before anyone even realized it was happening? Stay glued. From applause to uncertainty. As the quiet moments inside Royal Children's Hospital Melbourne continued to unfold, the atmosphere began to feel less like a passing mood and more like a reflection of something deeper. Something shaped by time, rather than chance. What was happening in front of the cameras could not be fully understood without looking beyond that room, beyond that single day, and back to a period when the public reaction to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry felt entirely different. In 2018, their presence carried an energy that was almost impossible to contain. Wherever they appeared, crowds gathered early, sometimes waiting for hours just to catch a brief glimpse. The anticipation did not remain still. It built gradually, rising with every passing minute until it turned into something visibly alive. People leaned forward, phones raised, voices ready, as though the moment itself was about to become part of history. When the couple finally arrived, the reaction was immediate and unfiltered. Smiles spread across faces without hesitation. Cheers broke through the air naturally. The connection between the public and the couple felt effortless, almost instinctive, as if both sides understood the moment without needing explanation. That memory now stood in quiet contrast to what was unfolding in Melbourne. The expectations had not disappeared. If anything, they had grown stronger over time. A royal visit in Australia still carried with it an unspoken promise of warmth, familiarity, and shared emotion. People still arrived in large numbers. They still watched closely, following each movement with attention. Yet the response, though present, felt fundamentally altered. Not missing, not absent, but changed in a way that was difficult to immediately name. Over the years, public perception had shifted in layers rather than in a single moment. Conversations about the couple had expanded beyond royal engagements alone. They had been shaped by headlines, public commentary, and ongoing discussions that often extended far beyond the events themselves. Even when unspoken in the moment, these narratives seemed to exist in the background, quietly influencing how each appearance was interpreted and how each gesture was received by those watching. This did not translate into open hostility or visible rejection. There were no confrontations, no clear signs of division in the physical space. Instead, what emerged was something far more subtle and harder to define. A sense of hesitation that sat quietly within the crowd. A carefulness that shaped reactions before they fully formed. It was as if people were no longer responding instantly from emotion alone, but instead pausing, processing, and then deciding how to express what they felt. Inside the hospital, this shift revealed itself in the smallest and most delicate details. Reactions often began a fraction of a second later than expected. Attention remained fixed, but the emotional weight behind it felt lighter. Interest was still present, but it no longer flowed freely or openly. Instead, it moved through a layer of quiet uncertainty that softened its impact. For those observing closely, the contrast was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. What once felt natural and unforced now appeared carefully measured. What had once been spontaneous enthusiasm now seemed restrained and controlled. Yet this change did not stem from a single moment or isolated event. It had developed gradually, shaped by time, context, and perception. And as this shift became clearer, the earlier silence that had defined the visit began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer just about what was happening in that room at that time. It was also about everything that had led up to it, everything that had slowly reshaped the way the moment was experienced and understood. Was the silence in that room truly accidental, or was it the final expression of something already reshaped long before their arrival? As every moment is reconsidered, a bigger question emerges. What if the distance felt today was carefully built long before anyone even noticed? Stay tuned. Carefully managed. Quiet, distant. By this stage, the shift in atmosphere no longer appeared like something that happened by chance. What had initially been felt as a quiet emotional distance was now clearly reflected in the very structure of the visit itself. The movements of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry were no longer just observed as public appearances, but as part of a carefully guided sequence, where every step seemed positioned with intention. There was a noticeable sense that each moment had been mapped out in advance, leaving very little space for unpredictability or spontaneous human interaction. Every transition from one part of the visit to another unfolded with deliberate control. There were no lingering pauses that might allow emotions to settle or evolve naturally. No unexpected conversations emerged from the edges of the crowd. No unscripted exchanges broke through the formal rhythm of the day. Instead, everything moved forward in a steady, controlled flow, as though the entire experience had been designed long before the first arrival in Australia. While such structure is common in high-profile royal engagements, the atmosphere it created here felt distinctly different, almost heavier in its precision. Certain familiar elements often associated with royal visits appeared noticeably reduced. Moments of open press engagement were limited, and the usual casual exchanges between public figures and onlookers were far less visible. In many traditional tours, these interactions help soften the formality of the occasion, creating a sense of shared experience between the visitors and the public. Here, however, those opportunities seemed shortened or carefully bypassed. Each interaction that might have built emotional connection instead passed quickly, as if guided by an invisible boundary that kept everything contained within strict limits. Inside Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne, the same pattern continued without interruption. Every interaction remained respectful and appropriate, but the tone stayed consistent with the controlled atmosphere that had defined the earlier parts of the day. Conversations were brief and purposeful. Movements followed the schedule without deviation. Even the moments captured by cameras felt intentionally framed, as though each visual was selected to represent order rather than organic connection. Nothing appeared wrong on the surface, yet nothing felt entirely open either. Then came the departure, which further reinforced the tone of the entire visit. As the engagements came to an end, the transition unfolded quickly and with efficiency. A convoy was already in place, waiting with engines running, forming a direct path away from the hospital grounds. There was no extended pause for farewell, no gradual winding down of the moment that would allow emotions to settle or re-engagement with the crowd. Instead, the movement toward the vehicles was immediate and structured, matching the same controlled rhythm that had defined their arrival earlier in the day. As the convoy slowly pulled away, it left behind more than just physical distance. It created a feeling that something intangible had widened between the public and the visitors. The space that remained felt quieter, almost unresolved, as if the emotional thread of the visit had not fully connected at any point. For those observing, this final image carried weight because it echoed everything that had unfolded before it: controlled movements, measured interactions, and carefully contained moments that never fully expanded into shared energy. Control, in many high-profile events, is designed to bring clarity, safety, and structure. It ensures that every moment runs smoothly and nothing is left to chance. Yet in this case, that same control seemed to shape a different outcome as well. By limiting unpredictability, it also reduced the natural openings through which genuine connection usually forms. The result was a visit that appeared seamless when viewed from a distance, yet felt increasingly detached when experienced in real time. And as each carefully managed moment passed without the spark of spontaneous engagement that people often expect, a deeper question quietly emerged, lingering in the background of everything that had been seen. Was this level of structure truly protecting the moment as intended, or had it unintentionally created the very emotional distance it was meant to prevent, leaving behind an experience that felt complete in form, but incomplete in feeling? As every tightly controlled moment slipped by without the expected burst of genuine emotion, a troubling question began to surface beneath the surface of the visit. Was this careful structure preserving the experience, or quietly building the very distance it was meant to avoid, reshaping everything into something far more uncertain? Let's find out. Beyond the frame of silence. As the visit continued moving forward, a deeper question began to form beneath the surface of everything that had already unfolded at Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne. What the camera showed was clear enough: structured greetings, composed exchanges, and carefully arranged moments that looked complete when viewed on screen. Yet what lingered outside those frames told a different kind of story, one that was harder to define, but impossible to fully ignore. The media presentation carried its usual confidence. Images were selected, moments were highlighted, and the overall impression suggested a smooth and successful engagement. Smiles were visible, handshakes were captured, and every official interaction appeared to follow the expected rhythm of a royal visit. From a distance, it looked orderly, even reassuring. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing seemed out of place. However, within the same spaces where those moments were happening, the crowd response carried a different energy. People were present in good numbers, standing close enough to witness every movement, yet their reactions were noticeably restrained. There was politeness in their behavior, careful attention in their eyes, and a quiet awareness that shaped how they responded. But the usual wave of excitement that often follows such appearances did not fully emerge. Instead, reactions arrived in smaller forms: a brief clap that did not grow into a cheer, a smile that remained personal rather than shared, a nod of acknowledgement that stayed contained within small groups rather than spreading through the crowd. Each response on its own seemed ordinary, but together they formed a pattern that felt unusually measured. The contrast between what was being reported and what could quietly be observed created a growing sense of complexity. Official coverage leaned toward positivity, highlighting the success of the visit and the respectful nature of the engagement. Yet beneath that narrative, the public atmosphere felt less certain, as though emotions were present but not fully expressed. It was not rejection, at least not in any visible or direct form. There was no hostility, no disruption, and no clear withdrawal from the moment itself. People continued to watch, continued to engage at a surface level, and continued to participate in the structure of the visit. But the depth of connection that typically defines such public appearances seemed slightly out of reach. This space between presence and participation became the most defining feature of the entire experience. It suggested that the public was neither fully embracing nor openly distancing themselves. Instead, they appeared to be observing carefully, responding cautiously, and withholding full emotional commitment for reasons that were not immediately spoken, but quietly understood in behavior. As Meghan Markle and Prince Harry moved through the remaining parts of their engagement, this subtle divide remained present in the background of every interaction. It did not interrupt the visit, nor did it challenge its progress, but it shaped the atmosphere in a way that could not be ignored. And as the day continued to unfold, it became increasingly clear that what was happening in front of the cameras was only part of the picture, while the more telling story was unfolding in the quiet space just beyond their reach. As Meghan Markle and Prince Harry continued their engagements, a subtle divide lingered beneath every interaction, shaping the atmosphere without ever breaking it. But if the cameras only showed half the truth, what was really happening in the unseen moments that began to redefine everything around them? Let's unravel the truth, the day that quietly redefined everything. As the visit progressed beyond the early exchanges and carefully observed moments, the weight of the first day began to settle into something more meaningful than just a series of public appearances. What had started as a simple arrival and a structured hospital engagement was slowly shaping into something that would define the entire tone of the tour in Australia. Each moment, whether large or small, seemed to connect back to what had been felt since the very beginning, a sense of quiet distance that no official framing could fully remove. Looking back at the sequence of events, the pattern became harder to dismiss. From the moment Meghan Markle and Prince Harry arrived, there had been an unusual stillness that followed them. Not silence in the literal sense, but a lack of the emotional rise that usually comes with such high-profile visits. The airport arrival had felt controlled and restrained. The hospital visit had carried politeness, but limited warmth. Even the interactions that were meant to feel personal appeared careful, measured, and slightly detached. Together, these moments formed a consistent tone that shaped how the entire day was experienced. As the hours passed, that tone did not shift in the way many might have expected. Instead of building into excitement or growing into a stronger public response, the emotional atmosphere seemed to stay at a steady level of restraint. People remained attentive, they continued to observe, and they followed each stage of the visit closely. Yet the energy that usually lifts such moments into something memorable did not fully emerge. It was present in fragments, but not in full force. This gradual buildup of controlled reactions and careful interactions began to define something larger than individual moments. The idea of a muted welcome slowly transformed from a simple observation into a symbolic reflection of the entire day. It was no longer just about how the crowd responded in a single location or how a specific interaction unfolded. It became about the overall emotional texture of the visit itself. Inside Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne and beyond, every exchange seemed to reinforce the same underlying impression. Nothing was openly negative, and nothing broke the structure of the visit. Yet the warmth that often fills such spaces felt reduced, as if filtered through an invisible layer of caution. Even official coverage, while presenting the visit as successful and composed, could not fully erase the sense that something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface. By the time the first day reached its conclusion, the realization had quietly taken shape. This was not simply a routine royal engagement where reactions varied naturally from moment to moment. It had developed into something more significant, a shift in atmosphere that influenced how every interaction was perceived from start to finish. The emotional tone set at the beginning had not faded or transformed. It had remained steady, shaping everything that followed. And in that steady, unchanging tone, a clearer understanding began to form. What unfolded in Australia was not just a quiet reception or an ordinary public visit. It was a moment that marked a subtle but important turning point, one that revealed how presence alone does not always guarantee connection, and how silence, when sustained, can begin to reshape the meaning of everything around it. So, what do you think really changed beneath the surface of this visit? And was the silence more powerful than the welcome itself? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.